Hey, welcome to video 6 in the Marine Invertebrate Biology course, and the first video on phylum Cnidaria, jellyfish, hydras, corals, and anemones. You'll be familiar with quite a few of the Cnidarians. This next few slides are going to be a slideshow of various types of species within the phylum Cnidaria. This, for example, is a hydrozoa, and you can see a brand new hydrozoan individual budding right out of the side of it. This is a stick hydrozoan, very common around New Zealand in inshore waters. Very beautiful, worth a close look if you're diving. As you dive more and more, you'll start to notice this feathery, turfy-like thing that looks possibly like an algae, but it is actually a hydrozoan. And these we sometimes call hydrozoan fuzz or hydrozoan turf. Blue bottles are a type of hydrozoan. Anemones. And this is a very common white-sided anemone with some of its defensive tentacles. Let's see if we can show them right here. These defensive tentacles after it's been touched and withdrawn. And then you see all of the tentacles out over here. And mushroom corals. We get into some of the bigger ones. This is an octocorallian. This is a colony of little bodies of Cnidarian. Leather coral. Sea whips. We have hard corals in New Zealand, but they're solitary rather than reef building. And then we get the reef building corals like this brain coral and the big ones like this. This one is known as Big Mama. It may be the largest animal in the world. It's actually a colony of little polyps, but and very, very old too. Here is a freshwater jellyfish. We get a bloom of these in the Rotorua lakes every year. Nobody really knows what the origin is. Possibly came from China, but they're not stingy, and they're only around for a couple of weeks. And here's one of our local jellyfish. So let's look at the basic body plan of Cnidaria. All right, we are coming away from the last video where we looked at sponges, and we remember that sponges didn't have any tissues. So all of the sponge cells could live independently, which if you remember, was called totipotent. And these ones, though, they have cells that cannot live independently. So they have cells which work together to perform a single function, and that is called a tissue. So as we go through this course, we're going up in terms of complexity. And as we said before, it includes the hydroids, jellyfish, anemones, and corals. All right, there are only two basic body forms in Cnidaria. So they can be colonial, but they'll be individual or colonial, but they're all of the individuals within the colony will still have the same body plan. They can be a polyp, and sessile means that they are stuck to something. They sit in one place. They can move a little bit, but they tend to be stuck to something, and that is a polyp. And then you have the free swimming, which is a medusa. Both forms could be exhibited during a Cnidarian's life cycle. They could have one dispersal phase, which is free swimming within an adult species that is sessile. So now if you go to your theory book on page 24, you can follow along and insert the labels onto this as a study guide. And this is the basic body plan for all Cnidarians. We'll start off with the bell. If this was a polyp, it would be called the body stalk. But in this case, because it's a free swimming one, it's called the bell. And let me pull up my ability to write. So subumbellar side and exumbellar side. The bell can also be called the umbrella. And with jellyfish, we have the exumbellar side or on top of, and the sub or below subumbellar side. The tentacles or the feeding methods, these arms can take a lot of shapes, but they all are below the bell in the jellyfish. And on the polyps, they're usually facing upwards and out into the water column. These are the hunting method. So once some prey is caught, then it gets stuffed into the mouth or manubrium. If we think about this as being a tube, then it's got these muscle fibers that go around it, and they can constrict. It can open up to allow food in, but it can constrict in order to hold digestive enzymes within the gut in order to digest something. So the two layers of skin or derm or tissue that these jellyfish or all cnidarians have are one on the outside, which is the epi or on top of, and derm, which means layer. And then that leads to having the endoderm on the inside, endo, as opposed to epi, or which is inner, and then derm, of course, again, layer. And then it's also called the gastroderm because this is lining the stomach, which is the gastric cavity. Gastro refers to digestion. And if you remember, we talked about the mesohyle in sponges, which separated the choanoderm on the inside and the outside, which was the pinacoderm, and it's a non-living proteinaceous matrix. So it's very similar in here, but sponges didn't have tissues. They have two cell layers, whereas these ones have actual tissues, and that is it's a similar design, but a separate kind of material on the inside. It's proteinaceous matrix. It's jelly-like, but instead of being called mesohyle, it's called mesoglia in the cnidarians. Meso means in the middle. So gastrovascular cavity or gut, that's the area for digestion. So if we follow along, or if we compare the polyp and the medusa, you still see these two layers of tissue with the mesoglia on the inside and two layers. So only two layers of living tissue, but obviously, as we've seen in our slideshow with the jellyfish and anemones can get quite large, but really there are only two layers of tissue, and that's known as diploblastic. Di for two, blast is a layer. Okay, if you learn these root words, it will help you very much. It's part of the language of science. Helps you figure out the meanings of words that you might not be familiar with, but if you could figure out the roots, then it tells you what they'll mean. So diploblastic, two layers. The polyp will be attached with a basal disc or sometimes with stolons. And if you remember from Periphery, stolons were those pointy projections which allowed for a new colony to grow out nearby to the adult ones, whereas the medusa is a free swimming one. So if you think about how a human being that you're very familiar with, you are laid out. If you cut yourself down the middle from crotch to head, right through the plane of your nose, and you would find that you have a symmetrical side on both sides. So maybe your heart is a little bit off to the left-hand side. It's sometimes people have one hand that's bigger than the other, or there can be some minor differences, but in general, it's a mirror image from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. Now, with cnidarians, they have a different type of symmetry, which is like the spokes of a wheel, or the radius, that the spokes radiate out from a central point. The radius of a circle is the same as a spoke on a wheel. And if you take slices along the spokes, then they will be symmetrical with all of the other slices. And so that is called radial symmetry. Sponges have no symmetry, if you recall. They grow according to whatever shape the substrate is and the current patterns are in order to allow them to maximize their feeding potential on a particular substrate on which they settle. And that is it for video 1 of the Cnidaria series, video 6 of the overall marine invertebrate biology course.